For my entire life, the concept of family was a tightly guarded, almost mythical idea, confined entirely to the four walls of our small, drafty, two-bedroom apartment sitting just above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. I grew up as the only child of a single father, a man who worked himself to the bone as a heavy-duty diesel mechanic just to make sure I had hot food on the table, warm clothes on my back, and a roof over my head that didn't leak when the autumn storms rolled in. My father, Thomas, was a quiet, fiercely independent man who spoke more with his actions than his words. His hands were permanently stained with deep, inescapable lines of black grease, his knuckles a rough, calloused roadmap of white scars from slips of the wrench, and his shoulders carried a perpetual slump from years of leaning over massive, unforgiving engine blocks in freezing garages. He smelled of WD-40, stale diner coffee, and diesel exhaust, but to me that smell was the very definition of safety. He rarely spoke about his past, and he almost never spoke about his extended family. Whenever I, as a curious, lonely child, asked about my grandparents, my aunts, or my uncles, wondering aloud why I was the only kid at my elementary school who didn't have somewhere to go for Thanksgiving, or why our battered tin mailbox was perpetually empty on Christmas morning, a dark, impenetrable cloud would instantly settle over his eye. The easy, rumbling laugh he usually possessed would die in his throat, replaced by a tight, practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He would wipe his hands on a greasy shop rag, pull me into a tight hug, and say, "We have each other, Julian. That's all the family we need. The rest of the world is just noise, and trust me, kid, we don't need their kind of noise." I accepted that answer for 26 years. I accepted the quiet holidays spent just the two of us, eating tacked-out Chinese food from the place down the street and watching old spaghetti westerns until we fell asleep on the couch. I accepted the fact that our family tree seemed to begin and end with him. I never questioned it because he was everything to me. He attended every parent-teacher conference in his work boots, cheered the loudest at my high school graduation, and worked overtime for 3 years to help me pay my way through a modest state college so I could become an English teacher. It wasn't until he passed away suddenly from a massive widowmaker heart attack on a freezing Tuesday afternoon in November that I truly understood the profound, echoing depth of his isolation. His death shattered my entire universe. The funeral was painfully small and agonizingly quiet. Just me, a few guys from his auto shop who awkwardly held their caps in their hands, and our elderly landlord, looking at the empty wooden pews in that small, echoing chapel. The silence of my father's life screamed louder than ever before. Going through his incredibly sparse belongings in the numb, blurred days following the funeral, I felt like an intruder in a life I thought I knew inside and out. In the back of his closet, hidden beneath a pile of heavy moth-eaten winter coats, I found a rusted metal lockbox. It was heavy, sealed tight, with a brass padlock. I broke it open with one of his own heavy-duty flathead screwdrivers. Inside, smelling of old paper and dust, were my birth certificate, my mother's death certificate, a few faded, black and white photographs of a grand, sprawling stone estate that looked like an aristocratic European castle, and a thick stack of letters tightly wrapped in fraying twine. Some of the letters were unsent, penned in my father's cramped, messy mechanic's handwriting, but most of them were addressed to him, written by a woman named Eleanor, his older sister, my aunt. Reading those letters over the next few weeks, sitting alone in the quiet apartment, was like peeling back the layers of a devastating psychological thriller. They painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a family deeply, pathologically obsessed with extreme wealth, social status, public optics, and unblemished pedigree. The Sterlings. My father had been the designated black sheep of a dynastic empire. He was the one who adamantly refused to attend the Ivy League university chosen for him at birth. The one who wanted to work with his hands and build things instead of managing hedge funds. And worst of all in their eyes, the one who eventually fell in love with and married a working-class diner waitress. That waitress was my mother, who tragically died of a sudden brain aneurysm when I was just 10 months old. The letters from Eleanor were dripping with a refined, educated venom. They scolded him relentlessly for tarnishing the family's immaculate country club image. They mocked his choice of profession, calling his life a childish rebellion covered in motor oil. The final letter, dated just a month after my mother's tragic death, was a cold, calculated ultimatum. It was typed on heavy, expensive watermarked stationery, and its words burned themselves permanently into my memory. Thomas, this blue-collar fantasy of yours has gone on long enough. It is time to end this embarrassing charade. Put the child up for adoption. He can be placed with a proper family who can actually afford to raise him. Return to the estate. Take your rightful position at the firm, and we will pretend this humiliating chapter of your life never happened. If you choose the boy over your own bloodline, consider yourself permanently excommunicated. We will not fund your poverty. My father had chosen me. He had packed whatever meager belongings he had left, walked away from tens of millions of dollars, severed all ties, and never looked back. He traded a life of luxury, an endless privilege, for a life of backbreaking labor. Also, he could raise me himself. Despite the blaring alarms and glaring red flags buried in those cruel letters, grief does incredibly strange, illogical things to a person's mind. When you lose the only anchor you have in the entire world, become desperate for a harbor, even a hostile one, I was entirely alone in a world that suddenly felt far too vast and incredibly cold. The silence of my apartment was deafening. I wanted to know where I came from. I wanted to see the faces of people who shared my father's blood, hoping beyond hope to catch a glimpse of his smile in the curve of a jaw, or the color of an eye, or the cadence of a voice. I naively, desperately wanted to believe that time had softened their hearts, that 26 years and the finality of my father's death had erased the petty, elitist grievances of the past. So, I did some digging online. It wasn't hard at all to find the Sterlings. They were prominent, fabulously wealthy, and heavily active on social media, constantly posting high-definition photos from charity galas, exclusive equestrian events, and yacht club regattas. I found my cousin, Chloe, Aunt Eleanor's daughter. After 3 days of drafting and deleting, I finally sent her a cautious, polite, agonizingly worded private message. I introduced myself, explained who I was, and gently shared the news of my father's passing. To my absolute surprise, she replied within the hour, and her tone was incredibly warm and welcoming. She offered her deepest condolences, claiming she had always wondered what happened to her mysterious Uncle Thomas, who vanished before she was born. We chatted online for a few weeks, exchanging basic pleasantries about our lives. I told her I was a high school English teacher who loved literature. She told me she worked in high-end public relations in the city. She seemed normal. She seemed kind. And then the invitation arrived in my inbox. It was a digital, gold-embossed flyer with elegant cursive font, the annual Sterling family reunion. Chloe added a long personal note beneath the RSVP link. You should absolutely come, Julian. It's time we finally met in person. It's a huge, casual gathering at my mom's summer estate. Everyone will be there. Aunts, uncles, cousins you never knew existed. I've already told a few people you might come, and they are so curious to meet you. It would mean a lot to bridge this gap. Please say yes. I was terrified, my stomach tying itself in violent, anxious knots. But I was also overwhelmed with a desperate, glowing hope that I was finally going to belong somewhere. I RSVP'd yes. I went to my school principal and took 3 days of unpaid leave from my teaching job. I spent an entire week's grocery budget on the premium ingredients to bake my father's famous spiced apple tart. It was the absolute only recipe he ever mastered in our tiny kitchen. A complex, delicate tart with a perfectly woven lattice crust, heavily spiced with fresh nutmeg, cinnamon, and a dash of clove. It was a small, humble piece of him that I wanted to share with the people who had erased him. I spent an entire Friday evening carefully slicing the apples to the perfect thickness, mixing the spices just the way he taught me, and braiding the crust, crying quietly into the dough as the smell of baking apples filled the empty apartment, reminding me of the man I had lost. I packed my best, albeit modest, clothes into my reliable, slightly rusted 10-year-old Honda sedan. I wrapped the pie tin securely in layers of heavy tin foil and swaddled it in a thick, clean towel to keep it safe and warm, and I hit the road before dawn the next morning. The drive was exactly 11 hours. 11 hours of gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, crossing 3 state lines, and watching the landscape gradually transition outside my window. The flat, industrial, gray concrete and smokestacks of my working-class hometown slowly gave way to the lush, rolling, impossibly green hills and gated communities of the affluent East Coast suburb where the Sterlings reigned supreme. During that endless solitary drive, with only the low hum of the radio keeping me company, I rehearsed every possible conversation in my head 1,000 times over. I imagined Aunt Eleanor seeing my face for the first time, recognizing her late brother's features in my jawline, and breaking down into tears of regret. I envisioned her pulling me into a long overdue embrace, apologizing for the years lost to stubborn pride. I imagined sitting around a massive rustic dining table with dozens of cousins, sharing stories about my dad, finally belonging to a tribe, finally having roots that extended deeper than the peeling wallpaper of my apartment. I convinced myself that my father's exile had been a tragic, youthful misunderstanding, a product of a different era, and that I was now uniquely positioned to heal a decades-old familial wound. I arrived at the estate just after 2 in the afternoon, and the sheer, unfathomable scale of the wealth immediately made my chest tight and my palms sweat. The property was staggering. Massive ornate wrought iron gates stood wide open, leading up a long, winding, crushed gravel driveway lined with ancient weeping willow trees that provided a cool canopy of shade. The lawn was perfectly manicured, looking more like a professional PGA golf course than a residential backyard. Parked elegantly along the circular driveway in front of the main house was a fleet of luxury vehicles that looked like a high-end dealership. Gleaming Mercedes-Benzes, customized matte black Range Rovers, vintage Bentleys, and sleek, low-profile Porsches. I slowly parked my dusty, dented sedan with its fading blue paint job at the very end of the line, feeling an immediate suffocating wave of imposter syndrome wash over me. I sat in the car for 5 minutes, trying to regulate my breathing. Finally, I took a deep, shaky breath, grabbed the carefully wrapped apple tart from the passenger seat, stepped out into the crisp air, smoothed out the wrinkles in my off-the-rack department store khakis, and walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps to the massive, arched oak front door. I could hear the dull, sophisticated roar of laughter, the sharp clinking of crystal glasses, and the swelling notes of a live string quartet playing classical music spilling out from the back patio. The front door was slightly ajar, propped open to let the breeze in, so I pushed it open and stepped into a full foyer that looked like it belonged in a European museum. The floors were polished, gleaming white marble that reflected the light perfectly. A sweeping, dramatic dual staircase curved upward to a second-floor gallery, and an enormous cascading crystal chandelier hung overhead, catching the afternoon sunlight and casting hundreds of tiny rainbows across the paneled walls. I walked tentatively through the wide hallway, following the noise of the party, holding the warm pie tin like a protective shield against my chest, terrified to touch anything, terrified to leave a scuff mark on the pristine floors. I stepped out through a set of massive French doors onto the sprawling, multi-tiered stone back terrace, and for a moment I was completely invisible in the sea of wealth. There were at least 50 people scattered across the vast lawn and the patio. Women in flowing designer sundresses, expensive sunglasses and wide-brimmed hats, men in crisp linen shirts, tailored trousers and loafers, holding glasses of expensive amber scotch. Caterers in pristine white uniforms wove silently and efficiently through the crowd, carrying heavy silver trays of caviar hors d'oeuvre, seared scallops, and tall champagne flutes. It was a picture of absolute, terrifying, flawless perfection. I stood there near the doors, scanning the sea of strangers, desperately looking for Chloe, the only person whose face I vaguely recognized from highly edited Facebook photos. Instead, I locked eyes with her, Aunt Eleanor. She was standing near a massive, custom-built stone fire pit at the edge of the terrace, holding a half-empty champagne flute, engaged in animated conversation with a group of older, distinguished-looking men. She was a striking, imposing woman in her late 60s, impeccably groomed, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a pristine white tailored dress and a thick, heavy string of flawless pearls around her neck. but it was her face that made my heart physically stop beating in my chest. She looked exactly like my father. It was uncanny, almost ghostly. She had the exact same sharp jawline, the same prominent cheekbones, the same piercing, deep-set eyes that I saw in the mirror every morning. But where my father's eyes had always been warm, tired, and full of gentle, enduring kindness, hers were ice-cold, hyper-calculating, and deeply predatory. She noticed me staring at her from across the patio. The polite, measured, artificial smile she was giving to the man next to her vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, terrifying scowl. She excused herself from her circle with a curt nod and began walking directly toward me, cutting through the crowd like a knife. As she approached, her designer heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the stone patio, the people around her noticed the sudden, drastic shift in her demeanor. The light-hearted conversation in our immediate vicinity began to die down rapidly. The silence rippled outward like a wave in a pond until a heavy, incredibly uncomfortable hush fell over the entire terrace. Even the hired string quartet seemed to sense the immense tension and awkwardly trailed off into a scraping silence. "Can I help you?" she asked, stopping exactly 3 feet in front of me, crossing her arms over her chest. Her voice was sharp, aristocratic, and dripping with an undeniable visceral condescension. She looked down at my scuffed brown shoes, traveled up my simple, unbranded clothes, and finally rested her gaze on the foil-wrapped pie in my hands, as if I were holding a bag of rotting garbage. "The delivery entrance is around the side of the house, by the kitchens, young man. You shouldn't be wandering through the main foyer." "Who let you in?" My throat went completely dry. All the saliva vanished from my mouth, leaving my tongue feeling like sandpaper. I'm not a delivery driver," I stammered, my heart hammering so furiously as against ribs I thought she could hear it. All of my carefully rehearsed speeches, all my desperate hopes for reconciliation, all my dreams of family vanished into thin air, leaving me completely exposed. "I'm Julian, Thomas's son." The name hit the silent air like a physical blow. Aunt Eleanor completely froze. The champagne flute in her hand trembled for a fraction of a second, spilling a single tiny drop of golden liquid onto the stone floor. But she recovered with terrifying, practiced speed. Her spine stiffened, her chin tilted upward, and her expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't look at me with a shred of recognition, nostalgia, or grief for her recently deceased brother. She didn't search my face for his memory. She looked at me like I was a toxic, infectious stain on her imported marble floor. Julian, she repeated slowly, tasting the syllables of my name and clearly finding them utterly repulsive. Just then, Chloe rushed over from the other side of the patio, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. "Mom, it's okay," she said nervously, putting a tentative, shaking hand on Eleanor's arm. "I invited him. We've been talking online for a few weeks. I thought it would be nice. Since Uncle Thomas just passed away, I thought it was time we met him." Aunt Eleanor ripped her arm away from her daughter with a violent jerk, without ever breaking her piercing, hateful eye contact with me. "You invited him?" she hissed at Chloe, though the venom in her voice carried clearly across the dead-silent patio for every single guest to hear. "Without consulting me? To my home? To a private family function?" "Mom, he's family," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking, shrinking visibly under the weight of her mother's terrifying glare. Eleanor turned her gaze slowly back to me. She looked me up and down once more, slowly taking in every single detail of my profound lack of wealth, my lack of social polish, and the desperate, pathetic, childlike hope that was undoubtedly written all over my trembling face. "Who invited you?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that was entirely devoid of human empathy. "Chloe did," I managed to say, my voice shaking despite my absolute best efforts to control it. "She sent me an invitation. She said it was a family reunion. I drove 11 hours to be here. I just wanted to meet my father's family." Aunt Eleanor let out a short, sharp, humorless scoff that echoed off the stone walls of the mansion. She took a deliberate step closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space, ensuring that her next words would carve themselves directly into my soul. "This is a gathering for real family," she said, stressing the word real, as if it were a physical weapon. Your father made his choices a long time ago. He decided that his foolish pride and his highly questionable tastes in lower-class company were more important than this family's legacy, our wealth, and our standing in society. He walked away from us. He threw away everything we spent generations building so he could play mechanic in the dirt with a waitress. You do not get to crawl back out of the woodwork decades later, carrying some cheap homemade pastry wrapped in foil, and expect a seat at my table. You are a ghost of a mistake we buried 26 years ago. You are not a Sterling, you do not belong here, and you never will. The words hung in the air, heavy, toxic, and suffocating. I looked around the patio. 50 people were watching this happen. Uncles I had never met, cousins whose names I didn't know, extended relatives who shared my exact DNA. Not a single one of them stepped forward. Not a single one of them spoke up to defend the memory of my father or to shield his grieving son from this horrific public execution. Chloe was staring firmly at her expensive sandals, her face flushed bright red with embarrassment, completely unwilling to defend the invitation she had extended, choosing her mother's approval and her inheritance over basic human decency. They were all entirely complicit in this cruelty. They were all devout, terrified disciples of Eleanor's toxic, shallow empire. And in that agonizing, silent eternity, with 50 pairs of wealthy, judging eyes bearing down on me, something fundamental inside my chest broke. But it wasn't my spirit, it wasn't my confidence. It was the delusion. All my life, I had pitied my father. I had thought he was a tragic, lonely figure, a man who had been unfairly banished from a kingdom of wealth, comfort, and ease, forced to live a grueling life of grease, sweat, financial panic, and physical struggle. I had thought he was the broken one. But as I stood on that immaculate, multi-million-dollar patio, looking into the cold, dead, empty eyes of his sister and observing the pathetic, cowardly faces of his blood relatives, the absolute truth finally, brilliantly snapped into focus. My father wasn't banished. He escaped. He hadn't been deprived of a family. He had heroically protected me from a cult. He chose the grease under his fingernails, the exhausting late shifts, the aching back, and the cheap, drafty apartments because the alternative was living his life in this sterile, soulless snake pit where love was strictly conditional on your bank account, your zip code, and your willingness to bow to a tyrant. He had looked at this world of endless privilege, looked at his infant son, and decided that raising me with integrity, warmth, and genuine affection was worth walking away from all of the money in the world. My father was the strongest, bravest, most incredible man I had ever known, and I had deeply insulted his memory and his ultimate sacrifice by driving 11 hours to beg for the scraps of affection from the very monsters he had sacrificed his inheritance to get away from. The fear, the anxiety, and the desperate, hollow need for their acceptance completely evaporated from my body in an instant, replaced by a deep, powerful, and absolute calm. The tight knot in my stomach untied itself. My hands stopped trembling. I stood up straighter, feeling the weight of my father's immense strength settling into my bones. I looked Aunt Eleanor directly in the eye, squaring my shoulders, refusing to shrink, refusing to let her see me bleed. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice perfectly steady, resonant, and carrying clearly across the silent terrace for everyone to hear. "I don't belong here." I looked down at the foil-wrapped apple tart in my hands. I had spent hours making it. It was my father's recipe. It was a piece of his heart. I wasn't going to leave it in a house full of vultures who wouldn't appreciate its worth. I tightened my grip on the tin. My father, I continued, holding Eleanor's cold gaze with my own burning intensity, refusing to look away, was a man of immense warmth, profound integrity, and genuine, unconditional love. He worked with his hands, yes, but those hands built a home filled with more joy than this entire estate has ever seen. He raised me with the kind of loyalty and kindness that clearly doesn't exist anywhere in your DNA. I drove 11 hours today because I thought I was missing a piece of my history. I thought I was missing a family. But standing here, looking at you, looking at all of you cowering behind your drinks, I realize I'm not missing anything at all. In fact, I'm incredibly grateful. Eleanor's eyes narrowed into angry slits. The muscles in her sharp jaw twitched. "Grateful for what?" she snapped. her voice losing its composed aristocratic edge, clearly unnerved by my sudden lack of intimidation. "Grateful that he had the strength to get away from you," I said softly, but with the crushing, undeniable weight of an absolute truth. "And infinitely grateful that he raised me in a dirty garage instead of a mansion, so I didn't grow up to be anything like the miserable, empty, cowardly people standing on this patio." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't give her the satisfaction of the last word, nor did I want to hear whatever venom she was preparing to spit next. I simply turned around and walked away. I walked back through the silent, staring crowd on the terrace, past the caterers who had stopped in their tracks, back through the museum-like marble foyer, and out the heavy oak front doors. I didn't run. I walked with the slow, deliberate, confident pace of a man who had just been released from a lifelong psychological prison sentence. I walked down the stone steps, got into my dusty, dented sedan, placed my father's pie safely and securely on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove down the long, willow-lined driveway without looking in the rear-view mirror a single time. The drive back took another 11 grueling hours. The sky darkened and it rained heavily for half of the journey, the windshield wipers beating a steady, rhythmic drum against the glass, blurring the headlights of passing semi-trucks. But I wasn't tired, I wasn't crying, I didn't even turn on the radio. The silence in the car wasn't lonely anymore, it was peaceful. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire 26 years. The crushing weight of wondering where I came from was finally gone. I knew exactly where I came from. I came from Thomas, about 4 hours into the drive, somewhere in the middle of a torrential downpour in rural Pennsylvania. I pulled over at a brightly lit, completely empty, run-down diner on the side of the highway. I walked inside, bought a cheap, steaming cup of black coffee from a tired-looking waitress who smiled warmly at me, went back outside, and sat on the cold, wet metal hood of my car under the glowing neon sign. I unwrapped the foil from the apple tart, broke off a massive, sticky piece of the lattice crust, and ate it with my bare hands in the freezing night air. It tasted like cinnamon, sugar, hard work, unyielding love, and absolute, undeniable freedom. By the time I finally pulled into my own small, cracked driveway the next morning just as the sun was coming up over the apartment buildings, my phone was flooded with notifications. There were over 24 messages from Chloe, followed by voicemails, paragraphs of frantic apologies, pathetic excuses about her mother's legendary temper, pleas for me to understand the complex family dynamics and the pressure she is under, and promises that we could meet up privately for coffee someday in the city when things cooled down. I didn't read them all. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't reply to a single word. I simply blocked her number, deleted her from all my social media accounts, and spent 20 minutes systematically blocking every other person's with the sterling last name I could find on the internet. They wanted exclusivity. They wanted to keep their bloodline pure. They could have it. I was permanently revoking my own access to their toxicity. I went inside my quiet apartment, took a long hot shower to wash off 22 hours of driving, and slept for 14 straight hours. When I finally woke up, the apartment didn't feel empty anymore. I took the only picture I had of my dad in his grease-stained overalls, standing proudly in front of his auto shop, bought a nice frame for it, and put it proudly on my nightstand right next to my bed. I went back to my high school classroom on Monday morning. I stood in front of my students, teaching them about literature, about character, about the choices people make, and I felt a profound sense of purpose. I went back to my friends, back to the simple, beautiful life my father had literally worked himself to death to provide for me. I finally understood, with bone-deep certainty, that family isn't something you inherit through a bloodline. It's not a trust fund, and it's not a last name. Family is something you build through mutual respect, shared burdens, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Aunt Eleanor and her sprawling estate had all the wealth in the world. They had the cars, the marble floors, the caterers, and the prestige. But they were spiritually and emotionally bankrupt, trapped in a prison of their own design, terrified of anyone who didn't fit their perfect mold. I, on the other hand, had a dusty 10-year-old car, an empty pie tin, a modest teacher's paycheck, and a heart overflowing with the exact kind of fierce, unwavering love my father had poured into me every single day of his life. I had his work ethic. I had his strength. I had his ability to walk away from poison. And for the first time in my entire life, standing in front of my chalkboard, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that I was the richest man in the world.